During Stray Kids trainee days, Hwang Hyunjin and Han Jisung couldn't stand each other. They've said it themselves several times, each in their own words. They fought constantly about small things, about big things, about nothing at all. It got bad enough that their instructor had to step in. He lined everyone up and asked each person to say what needed to be said. Hyunjin went first. He chose to apologize. Then Han stepped forward. However, instead of apologizing, he said there was one person in the room he hoped would stop bothering him. Everyone in the room knew he was referring to Hyunjin. Hyunjin ran out to the bathroom, and Han followed him in. And standing there, the two of them made a deal to ignore each other, act normal in front of everyone else, and let whatever this was between them just stay exactly where it was. That was their relationship at this point. Stray Kids debuted in March 2018. Hyunjin and Han debuted together. They now had to train together, perform together, and live together as one complete group. All the while, they kept up their deal. However, years later, they're two of the closest people in the group. Hyunjin has said that out of every artist alive, Han is the one he admires the most, with Han reciprocating his admiration. So, if they once despised each other, how in the world did they get where they are today? To understand that, we have to go back to before they ever met. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about Stray Kids, just like this, consider subscribing. Hyunjin came to JYP Entertainment with nothing. A JYP agent spotted him while he was out shopping with his mom in middle school, and he signed on as a trainee without any prior dance training, any vocal training, any real experience at all. The training system isn't designed to wait for people like that. It's built around trainees who already have years behind them by the time they walk in. And most people who start as far behind as Hyunjin did don't survive it. But Hyunjin studied. He watched the people around him. He worked until he'd made up for what he was missing, one thing at a time. Han had already been training by the time Hyunjin joined. He'd been there for about a year at this point. He specialized in rap, and he was good at it. Good enough that he developed a particular idea of who he wanted to be as an artist and how he wanted to operate. There was a kind of distance that came with that. Not hostile, exactly. Just closed off in a way that made it hard to get close to him. He wasn't really someone the other trainees could approach easily, and he wasn't trying to change that. He thought that's what being serious looked like. Both of them were born in 2000. In Korea, age shapes almost everything about how people relate to each other. Who speaks first, who defers to whom, what you're expected to give, and what you're allowed to ask for. The older you are, the more respect you're owed. The younger you are, the more you're expected to show. These two were exactly the same age, which meant neither of them had any structural reason to automatically defer to the other. And yet, Hyunjin, from basically the beginning, looked at Han like he was already someone, like a celebrity, not a fellow trainee still figuring it out like he was, not another person grinding through evaluations and trying to hold his place in the system, but something complete, something finished. He respected Han before a single real conversation had ever happened between them. Han looked at Hyunjin and saw a rival. That never fully went away on Hyunjin's side. Years later, he would say that out of every artist alive, Han is the one he admires the most. But the first time that admiration showed up between them, it started a war. Han had hurt his ankle during training, but he was still wearing military boots with heels anyway. Hyunjin noticed and said something about it, worried that wearing them would make things worse. He was just being friendly, maybe trying to show Han he was paying attention, that he cared. But Han snapped back. He wasn't trying to start something, he just didn't know how to receive that kind of feedback from someone yet. For years, he'd built his identity around being self-sufficient, focused, and someone who didn't need to lean on the people around him. That's what being serious looked like to him, and that's the type of person he thought he needed to be in the training system. And so, when Hyunjin showed up with something genuine, something kind, Han's instinct was to block it out, assuming Hyunjin was being malicious. Not out of cruelty, he just didn't have a way to let it in. Hyunjin hadn't been trying to pick a fight, he'd just noticed something and said something, the way you do when you actually care about the person in front of you. But what came back at him was cold. and the version of himself he felt he needed to present after that was colder than he actually was. Not because that's who he wanted to be, but because he thought that's what the situation required. That's what made it so costly for both of them. Han thought distance was discipline. Hyunjin thought coldness was the only language Han would respect. And so they both ended up further from who they actually were, pushing each other in a direction neither of them had chosen, because neither of them yet understood what the other one actually needed. Because of this misunderstanding, their later practices became increasingly more difficult. They'd call each other out in front of their teachers and in front of everyone else standing in that room. You focus on your dancing! You focus on your rapping! The words weren't so much about helping each other, rather they were intended to pressure the other. It was some rivalry that didn't need to be explained or negotiated, because both of them understood it completely and both of them kept feeding into it. Then one night, something broke. While at the company, Hyunjin slammed a door and went downstairs. We don't know exactly what started this, but it wasn't a great situation. They were so upset with each other that they almost started physically fighting. They say they likely would have had the other members not gotten between them. At some point, Hyunjin went back upstairs and tried to find the words for what was actually happening. Tried to explain what any of this was really about, but nothing came out. He didn't even fully understand why he was that angry at Han in the first place. Months of it had built up like that. By the time something finally snapped, the reason didn't even matter that much anymore. Their relationship had gotten bad. Really bad. It's likely around the same time the instructor lined them up. Everyone was supposed to say what they needed to say, clear whatever was sitting between people out into the open. Hyunjin went first and apologized. He never intended to fight with Han. He literally admired him at first. He felt guilty for letting himself get sucked into it and fighting with someone that impressed him. However, instead of doing the same thing, Han said there was one person in that room he hoped would stop bothering him. Everyone in the room knew who he meant. They'd seen all their verbal and nearly physical fights. The war, as both of them described it. Hyunjin, who had just apologized in front of all of them, ran to the bathroom. Han chased after him, and standing there, the two of them decided to make a deal. Let's just ignore each other and act like nothing's up in front of the others. Han thought he was being cool when he said that, but he wasn't. He was just a kid who didn't know how to back down, doing what felt like the only move available to him in that moment. Hyunjin apologized, but now he was walking out of that bathroom with an agreement to practically forget Han. They agreed to silence. What neither of them knew yet was that it wouldn't always hold like that. Years later, Hyunjin would write Han a letter saying he usually didn't cling to relationships, but that Han was the one he couldn't let go of. But they're not there yet. Right now, the plan is to pretend. Stray Kids debuted in March 2018, and for a while, they managed it. They trained together, performed together, shared a dorm together. Their deal was still in place, and they didn't talk much. 2 Kids Room, one of Stray Kids series, launched that August. It was a show built around pairing members together, getting them to open up, and dig into their dynamic. A lot of combinations got an episode that year. However, Hyunjin and Han weren't one of them, not in Volume 1 or Volume 2. The show moved through nearly the whole group without ever putting the two of them in the same room, likely on purpose. Who knows what could have happened if they were asked to feature in the series. But then something started changing. In the later days of their rookie year, when they had more time to actually talk, Hyunjin started to break. Not on stage, not in front of cameras, but off to the side when he was just with the members. He'd gotten to a point where he no longer liked who he was. He started opening up about having a hard time, about wanting to change his personality, about being someone he didn't want to be anymore. Han heard it, not as some rival of war he'd tried to make himself out as, but as a fellow member of Stray Kids. He was the person in the room, while another human was falling apart a little. And somewhere in listening to Hyunjin go through all of that, something changed in him too. Because the person Hyunjin was describing, someone performing a version of himself that didn't fit, someone who'd gotten so caught up in the competition that he'd lost track of who he actually was, wasn't that different from what Han had been doing all along.
너 그때 엄청 울고 나 침대에서 진짜 많이 울었어.
아 진짜?
내가 얘한테 약간 뭐라고 해야 될까? 안 그래도 좀 마음이 약한 찌질이 스타일인데 마음에 비수를 꽂았구나 내가.
찌질이란. 아무튼.
However, that shift alone didn't mean everything was fine between them. In December 2019, JYP Entertainment released a statement saying Han had been experiencing psychological anxiety, that he felt extreme tension in situations around groups of people. The condition had been treated and was improving, but it had been real, and it had been boiling up for a long time, long enough that it had become something he couldn't manage on his own anymore. By the time their 2022 Two Kids Room episode came out, things were vastly different for both of them. Han used to be much more timid, with Hyunjin being bolder. Now it had practically flipped. Han was bolder, and Hyunjin was more reserved. They hadn't decided to change toward each other. All those years of watching and matching and pushing was who they used to be. But the people they now were in 2022 were representative of the other's influence. There was one stretch where Han went quiet, more than his usual quiet. Hyunjin noticed, and instead of going to him, he stayed back on purpose. Han was someone the members leaned on to lighten the mood, and Hyunjin knew that if he showed up while Han was already going through something, Han would feel the weight of that expectation and try to perform his way through it anyway. So Hyunjin did the harder thing, which was nothing. He watched from a distance and said nothing, and hoped that was enough. He kinda knew how Han was. He knew how to best cater towards him. Han didn't even find out about his decision until the Two Kids Room episode.
그게 혹시 부담이 됐으려나? 내가 뭔가 이렇게 내가 또 다가가면 너가 또 날 웃겨줄 것 같은 거야.
When things are good between them, there's a quality to it that doesn't exist anywhere else in the group. Han makes Hyunjin laugh in a way that nobody else quite manages. Hyunjin has said it's not even the joke itself. It's something specifically Han, about the way he lands things, the timing, the expression, whatever it is, that just makes the same material hit differently than it would from anyone else. This is what they are at their best. Great friends, enjoying each other's company and being there for each other. Though the MANIAC Tour wasn't so great for them. During the US leg of the MANIAC World Tour, they fought right before a show. They didn't have any time to try and resolve it. They still had a show to perform whether they were ready or not. And so they walked out on stage with it still sitting between them, heavy and pulling on them, and performed their usual set in front of thousands of people who had no idea anything was wrong. However, at some point mid-set, while still rapping, while still moving, they looked at each other in a way that told the other they were sorry, and the show continued on. The crowd had no idea what had just happened. They made up in front of thousands of people without any of them knowing it was happening. They came off stage and finally got a chance to apologize to each other with their words. Whether consciously or not, they didn't want to go through the same thing they felt as trainees. Whatever they fought over, they couldn't bear dwelling on it. When Han wasn't doing well, and when his anxiety acted up more than usual, he found it harder to even just talk to Hyunjin normally, let alone joke around with him the way they usually did. But neither of them were doing anything about it. Neither of them fully grasped what was going on, and they didn't know what to say. The days kept passing, and the distance between them just started to feel eerily comfortable. Not exactly comforting, but things grew stagnant. At some point, Hyunjin decided he'd had enough of that. He pitched the company on organizing a group content shoot in Gapyeong, using it as a reason to get everyone together, but really, he just wanted to finally talk to Han. The shoot was the excuse. Han was the actual reason. The kid who once took Reed to pretend Han didn't exist was now proposing an entire production shoot just to get some time with him. They drove out in 2 cars, stopped at McDonald's on the way, spent the night cooking dinner and watching old performances and singing karaoke together. From the outside, it looked like any other group trip, and for most of it, it probably was. But Hyunjin was waiting for the moment when the cameras stopped being the point, and it was just the members in a house at the end of the night. That was when he was going to say something. Han showed up to Gapyeong. However, his stomach started hurting, but not because he was sick. Han had come to Gapyeong with something he needed to say too. The whole evening, as they cooked dinner and watched old videos and sang karaoke, he'd been building up to it, going over what he wanted to say, how to say it, and whether he could actually go through with it when the moment came. But through all of it, his anxiety was cascading into his body. He desperately wanted to be there. He wanted to talk it out, but he left early. He sent a long message to the group chat instead, putting into words everything he couldn't get out in person. The members who read it cried.
이제 거기서 이제 얘기를 하려고 그랬는데 이제 너가 이제 도망갔지만 그 이유가 있었지.
그치. 근데 진짜 그때는 말을 하려고 했지.
Part of what Han had been carrying was something he'd only recently been able to name. When he was struggling creatively and watched Hyunjin excelling as an artist, it made things harder. He genuinely admired Hyunjin, he always had, but admiration and jealousy aren't that far apart, and for Han, they had a way of getting intertwined with each other. It's difficult to watch, but it was just how he felt. Around 2024, they fought again. It was nothing like their days as trainees or rookies. This time, it was just the two of them, saying things that had been sitting there too long. And at some point, Hyunjin said something that stopped Han completely. I have compassion for you. Han didn't know what he meant by it. He didn't want to ask, so he just cried, went back to his room, and looked it up on his phone. When he found out the definition, he understood what Hyunjin actually had been trying to say. That he saw Han, the real version, the one who'd spent years feeling like he didn't quite fit into the group the way everyone else did. That as talented as Han is, the team side of things had always been where he struggled, and Hyunjin had been watching that the whole time without ever quite knowing how to reach him. When Han came back with the definition, something changed in him again. He understood how Hyunjin felt about him better. They finally talked about it, albeit through an argument, but they weren't just imagining what could happen in their heads anymore. A little while later, during a break, the kind where members scatter and don't really check in on each other, Han sat with his phone for 3 hours. He thought about where things had been left, about Gapyeong, about the MANIAC Tour, about all the times one of them had almost said something and hadn't. He thought about Hyunjin being in Sapporo right now, alone, on a trip he'd chosen to take by himself. He typed 3 words. You in Sapporo? To us, that doesn't sound like anything super special. But usually during these breaks, the members don't communicate with each other. They each take a chance to exist in their own worlds. So by reaching out, Han was breaking that usual cycle. Hyunjin saw it and felt totally surprised. He knew exactly what it had taken Han to send something that small.
그때 좀 귀여웠어. 근데 너가 만약 그런 거 안 했잖아? 그러면 그냥 지냈을 것 같은데.
Hyunjin replied, told him he was there, and that turned out to be enough to get them moving again. In a Two Kids Room episode from 2025, Hyunjin read a letter he'd written to Han. I usually don't cling to relationships. The reason I held on to you was probably because you were that precious to me. Your humor, your emotions, your music, I love them all as your fan. You don't know what it means for me to be in the same team as you. Back in 2019, during their first Two Kids Room, Han had written one too. Before any of those fights and growth that would come later in their careers, our past selves would be shocked to see our present selves. They say if you have just one friend who truly trusts you, that's a successful life. I already succeeded. Han called it success in 2019. He'd already decided it was enough, and then they kept going anyway. 2 people who once stood in a bathroom and agreed to pretend the other didn't exist ended up lying and breaking that promise. But maybe it was the best outcome possible. If you want to see how Felix became exactly what Bangshan needed and how they built their relationship, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching. Bye 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 bye.